Ah. Ah.
What the hell?
Into the unknown!
Yes, we are going into the unknown. That is the name of the brand new Switch from Gateron. Well, it's called Unknown to be precise. What kind of name is Unknown? From the makers of the Oil King and the China Joys and the North Pole comes the Unknown switches from Gateron. Well, this time there's some significance to the name, right? Unknown is called that because it uses a brand new proprietary switch stem made of, you guessed it, ultra high molecular weight polyethylene, or UHMWPE. Umpy? Gateron being Gateron decided to be creative and created another hilariously ridiculous name. Well, you ready to go into the unknown? Let's get started. So it's been a hot minute since Gateron played around with the UHMWPE material in their switches. I think one of their first attempts, it might have been the last also, was with the Hippo linear switches before. However, this time the UHMWPE stem is a little bit different. According to Gateron, they invested into a brand new mold just for these UHMWPE stems, supposedly taking care of some of like the issues they had before, like proper fit, shrinkage, and stuff like that. So these are actually linear switches with a full 4mm travel, so it's not a long stem, and given the UHMWPE stem, they should have a smooth operation and that poppy and marbly UHMWPE sound. Some people call it wet. Let's take these apart and do some analysis of what they're made of, the specifications, as well as if they share any parts with any other switches from Gateron. So first up is the housing. It's actually a Frankenstein housing in both color and material. The top housing is made of gray nylon PA66, while the bottom is actually a black colored ink material found in ink blacks. You know what else has this combination exactly? Yes, the Oil King switches. Exact housing material combination. However, the one interesting thing is this. The Oil King upper housing is actually a newer design with a long horizontal LED slit on the bottom and an upside down Gateron logo. Apparently the upside down logo signifies like the newer lubing process, probably the reason why Oil Kings are great stock. However, the unknown switches look different. You know what it actually resembles? The older Gat Yellow KS3s. The housing mold seems to be pretty much the same in my opinion. Not sure if it makes much of a difference, but just wanted to point to that. The bottom housing looks exactly the same as the Oil King, so not a bad thing since Oil King bottom housing is actually ultra smooth. Now going to the stem. Other than the fact that it's made of UHMWPE, the mold is supposed to be brand new. Compared to some of the other Gateron stems, the blunt stem end shows that it's not really modeled after the older step stems of the previous generation, yellows and so on. Rather, it looks closer to the design of like the newer CJs or the Oil King stem. Another sign of this is when you take a look at the upper stem cuts, the unknown actually has double cuts you see like on the newer switches like the Oil King and even the North Poles. The spring is a black color spring, single stage standard length. It also is on the lighter side at just around 57 grams. Overall, even with the lighter spring, it didn't feel that light though, or weird. It's heavier than like a red switch, and then it's lighter than like a yellow. So what do these feel like and sound like completely stock? Well, from a feel perspective, they come lightly factory lubed, so they don't feel too bad. I feel like they could use a little bit, of Crytek's Tool 5, but if you wanted to, you could use them stock. The housing itself is also tight, so no need for films either. So I don't remember the last time, honestly, I had to film a new switch, so I love that about these new switches. Let's take a listen to the stock sound, shall we? For this, we are using my poor but trusty Portico with an aluminum plate as a test bed. And for keycaps, the same ePBT pink on blacks as usual. So this way, you can compare it to some of my old previous switch reviews, and you kind of do a compare and comparison, right? So let's check it out. Overall, in stock form, these switches are completely passable. They do exhibit a higher pitched tone when used completely stock. A little bit of Crytek's Tool 5 really takes care of that well, and I would actually recommend it. As usual with the switch test, I will be comparing the unknown switch against a few other different switches to give you a reference of how they fare. Since this is a UHMWPE stem switch, I decided to put it against a few other UHMWPE based stem switches. For example, the SOTC, which is made by JWK, and the Strawberry Ice by Tecsee. In addition, I also put some other popular Gateron switches into this mix, like the updated Ink Black V2s with the new housing, the Oil Kings, as well as the Gateron Yellow KS9 2.0s. I try to use all the in-stock switches only, so if you want, you could actually pick these up after the show or the review. Links in the description below. Now then, let's go into the measurements, shall we? First up is the stem wobble test, and as usual, I use a digital caliper to measure the deflections and provide you the objective measurements. So looking at the chart, the new Gateron unknown switches are pretty good, right up there with what we would expect now from new switches. It's not the absolute best, but it's still very commendable. The Ink Black V2s with the updated mold comes in first with the lowest total diagonal deflection of just 0.45mm, then the Oil Kings at 0.5mm. The SOTC, the KS9, and the unknowns are all pretty much in tied the third place with a solid 0.57-0.58mm diagonal deflection. Finally, the Tecsee Strawberry Ice show the most movement, at least in the batch I had, but none of these are bad in any way possible. So now let's go to the sound test of these switches, shall we? Hope that helps you get a feel. In my opinion, I feel like the JWK SOTCs were like the clear clack winner here, and the Ink Black does sound the deepest out of them all, by a small margin at least. What does the frequency measurements show us? So when I look at this, I notice that many of the switches do exhibit very similar sound frequencies, at least this collection. They are either mid or mid-low tone switches in my opinion. I think the exceptions here are the JWK SOTCs and the Gateron Yellow KS9s, which are on the higher end, which actually show a dominant high frequency than the others. Where things get a little bit more interesting is that the Ink Blacks generally throw out more lower frequencies, while the Tecsee Strawberry Ice throws out like a really broad range of sounds. However, based on my ear test, the two switches seemed very similar, with the Ink Black sounding a little bit deeper. I feel like the Unknown and the Oil Kings are also very similar in sound by ear, and their ranges also seem to kind of align to that as well. Based on this data, as well as my subjective opinion, I will put the sound ranking for you also in the next chart as well, so you get a nice little visual. So backed by popular demand, here is the Keyboard switch performance comparison chart. I hope that this helps to put things into a visual chart to help you decide on the switch that you are looking for specifically. So as usual, we'll be looking at 5 different criteria for the switch performance. It will be in stem wobble, switch smoothness, switch sound level, essentially the volume, sound pitch or frequency, and finally, the cost of the switch. So first up is the switch stem wobble. As shown before in the stem deflection measurements, the winner of this group is the updated Gateron Ink V2s. It had a total diagonal deflection value of 0.45mm and places it right in the lead. Then comes the Oil Kings, just right behind with 0.5mm deflection. And most of the switches of this group kind of comes in third with a deflection of 0.57mm. So finally, the Tecsee Strawberry Ice trails the pack with 0.64mm measurement. Next is the smoothness of the switch. These are all fairly smooth switches overall. I don't think any switches nowadays are that rough or scratchy. However, you can really see how far Gateron is pushing the smoothness aspect by looking at some of the new polished stem switches. Like out of these, the Oil Kings lead the pack with the smoothest operation, while the biggest surprise of the test is probably the Gateron Yellow KS9 Pro 2.0's at close second. I know that the smoothness is something they wanted to improve with like the second update, and they definitely achieved that. Wow, from a budget switch nonetheless. These are like 23 cents. Not far behind is a new JWK SOTC switch, also very smooth, and the smoothest UHMWPE stem switch of this group. It's crazy to think that now one of the smoothest switches of the old days, the Ink Blacks, can't even make it to the top 3 of this chart. So after the Ink Black V2s come the rest of the UHMWPE stemmed switches. While the Tecsee Strawberry Ice and the Unknown are fairly similar from a smoothness perspective, the Tecsee has a slight edge, I feel like. Not terribly scratchy switches by any means, but given that most of the newer Gateron switches come with like polished stems, even a UHMWPE switch has trouble competing up there with those guys. Alright, moving on to sound. First sound criteria is the sound level, or the volume. This is whether the switch is loud or quiet. Out of this group, I would say that the JWK SOTC switches top out the chart with a fairly loud sound, followed closely by the Gateron Yellow KS9s. Next up is the Oil Kings, followed very closely once again by the new Unknown switches. They have a very similar volume level, which is about medium, I feel like. Ink Blacks are generally considered to be pretty subdued, which shows here, and the Tecsee Strawberry Ice is also a fairly quiet switch. If you know how loud an Ink Black is, you can pretty much imagine how loud a Tecsee Strawberry Ice is as well. So not the loudest switch out there. Next sound criteria is the pitch. So this is a combination of the objective spectrum analysis as well as my opinion, the subjective one from listening to how they work. First off, none of these switches are actually very high pitched, maybe with the exception of maybe the JWK SOTCs and the Gateron Yellow KS9 Pro 2.0s. Such a long name. I guess these are what you may consider more clacky, but since this comparison is relative to each other, there will be switches that are higher and ones that are lower in frequency. As mentioned, the JWK SOTC are the highest pitch out of this group by far, which is fairly unusual for a UHMWPE stem. Then the Gateron Yellow KS9 Pros follow closely behind. Honestly, the rest of the switches are fairly deep sounding switches. I would say that like the Oil Kings are like the mid-level tone, then you have the Unknown close behind that, and the Strawberry Milk and the Ink Blacks coming in at the deepest pitch level. And now, final and the most objective criteria is the price. Most of these switches were in a similar price range with the exception of the KS9 Yellows. At the time of the review, the most expensive switch of this group is the Gateron Ink Black V2s at 75 cents a piece. The JWK SOTC followed with about 70 cents a switch per piece. Then the Unknown and the Oil King at 65 cents a piece, and the Tecsee Strawberry Ice at 60 cents a piece. The value king obviously is the Gateron Yellow KS9 Pro 2.0. Honestly, can you believe that a switch that costs like a third of the others is actually one of the smoothest switches in this comparable as well? So I hope that this slew of tests and this chart helps to put things into perspective in terms of like the various different performance metrics and helps you make the best decision in terms of what you are looking for in a switch. Alright, before I jump into my final thoughts, let's take a look at the full typing test with the Lubed Unknown switches. Check it out. Alright, I hope you can see why I say that the Unknowns are best lubed. They do have a deeper and smoother sound when lubed, and they also feel smoother as well. I will actually take the time to lube this with a nice coat of Createkeebs 205. You probably wouldn't regret it at all. Now with all the testing out of the way, what is my final thought on the knowns? Well, I think of these kind of like essentially the UHMWPE stemmed Oil Kings. Similar pricing, pretty good stem housing and stem tightness. Where I feel the knowns have an edge is like the sound. If you're looking for that wet, marbly UHMWPE sound, then this is probably it. However, where it definitely loses out pretty clearly is the stem smoothness. There's like no comparison between the Oil Kings and the knowns in this area. Surprisingly, the polished palm on the Oil Kings are far smoother than like the standard UHMWPE on the knowns. I thought perhaps it was like the housing that was not as smooth, so I actually tried swapping the stem into the CJ housings, which are very smooth, and realized it still felt the same. So it's actually the stem of the knowns and not the smoothness of the housings at all. And finally, like most new Gateron switches, the knowns they actually do seem to work with the GMK keycaps in north facing without much interference, so I would say it's okay. And I hope this video was helpful in putting things into more of an objective and also visual perspective. And as usual, if you enjoyed the video or its content, please like and subscribe, and I'll have more content for you in the future. Thank you.